Well, one thing, she wasn't going out to the field and watch Chuck Ryan cover himself with glory, the big gorilla. Ryan covered the right after her last class, she dashed into the bicycle rack, grabbed her bike, and started for home. She took the first corner at breakneck speed and nearly collided with another bike. The rider was Grant Davidson. Hi, she greeted him when she had recovered her breath. Say, do you go home this way too? It's funny we never ran into each other before, isn't it? Yes, he replied, and rode on in silence. Oh dear, she thought, this is where I ought to start a perfectly fascinating conversation or something. But he was riding so rapidly that it took all her breath just to keep up with him. Soon they were speeding along a street heading for the edge of town. Do you live this far out? Asked Grant finally. Well, no, but I'm going this way today, she said casually, and that's no lie, she thought. The houses got farther and farther apart. The sidewalks disappeared, fields of ragged goldenrod bordered the road, and still Grant pedaled along in stony silence, and Jane racked her brains for something to say. Suddenly he slowed down and stopped at a narrow dirt lane. Well, so long, he said abruptly, and before Jane could open her mouth, he turned off into the lane and disappeared into a cloud of dust. Boy, what a brush-off, she muttered, staring after him. Well, it didn't take a brick house to fall on her, but as she wheeled her bike around, she heard a sound she hadn't heard since she left Westhope, the eager nicker of a horse who sees a friend approaching. She couldn't go back to town until she had at least seen the horse, even if it was only a farm animal. She thrust her bike under some bushes and started cautiously up the lane on foot. At the first bend she stopped. There was a farmhouse, old and comfortably ugly with wide sagging porches, and beyond it was a barn, a stable, and scattered out buildings. A rail fence surrounded a broad expanse of sloping meadow. Grant Davidson stood at the fence with his back toward her, rubbing the ears of a bay horse, a little fellow hardly more than a colt, who was playfully nipping his shoulder. In the meadow 2 other horses were grazing, a gray and a black. One glance told Jane that there were no farm animals. There were fine saddle horses, beauties all of them. Grant turned and went into the barn, and the little bay, with a toss of its head and a flourish of his heels, cantered off to join the other horses. If only she had an apple or a carrot, she might coax one of them over to the fence. I suppose I'm trespassing or something, she thought, but I don't see how they can do anything more than throw me out. At the corner of the barn she ran smack into Grant. He was wearing heavy boots and carrying a rake and a shovel. Oh, hello, she said lamely. So this was his after-school job. Do you suppose they might mind if I just went and talked to the horses? Who? He asked. Why, they, she nodded toward the house. The people that own them? Oh, I don't know, he answered evasively. Horses don't much like being squealed at and pawned over. He turned his back on her and walked off toward the stable. Jane stared at him, seething. Why, she sputtered, what did he take her for, anyway? Maybe he thought that if he was rude enough, she would get mad and go away. Well, I just won't, she thought grimly, at least not until someone comes out of the house and orders me away. She perched on the fence and watched Grant clean one of the box stalls, raking out the old straw and litter. It reminded her pleasantly of the way she had hung around the stables at Westhope, watching Eddie putter around with his chores, but Eddie treated her like a human being. She tried again. Do you work here every day? He nodded without looking up. Do they ever let you ride any of the horses? A smile flitted across his face, then he replied shortly, Yeah, it's part of my job. The horses need exercise more than they get. Jane's words tumbled out. Oh, do you think would they ever let me ride? I'd give anything to. They aren't livery stable hacks, he replied scornfully. They're fine horses with sensitive mouths. But I can ride. Honestly, I can. But Grant had disappeared. He returned in a minute with a load of clean straw and began spreading it evenly across the floor of the stall. Jane was almost crying, with anger and disappointment. I can too ride, she repeated. That's what a lot of people think, he said rudely, and went on. You know anything about horses? Ever clean out a stall? Can you saddle a horse, rub it down properly? No, she said crossly. The stableman did all that. That's what I thought, he replied, and continued his work. The horses were grazing on the far side of the meadow, and Jane knew there wasn't a chance of coaxing one over to the fence. Maybe I can get acquainted with the people who live here, she thought desperately. There must be some way. I've just got to ride those horses. Oh, Grant, called a woman's voice from the house. He set down his rake and walked off without a backward glance. Jane sat on the fence and thought, and the more she thought, the madder she got. So Grant Davison thought if you couldn't muck out a stall, you couldn't ride a horse. Of all the pig-headed, bad-tempered dopes, she muttered, feeling thoroughly pig-headed and bad-tempered herself. I'll show him. She jumped down from the fence and pushed open the stable door. In a corner of the back room, she found a pair of overalls hanging from a nail. They were much too big, but she stepped into them and rolled the pants up around the ankles and seized the rake. She went to work where Grant had left off, raking out the trampled litter with vicious jabs. Then she scraped and smoothed and packed the packed clay of the floor with the square-ended shovel. To her surprise, she found she was beginning to enjoy herself. She spread the clean, shining straw on the floor with as much care and pride as if she were setting a table for a dinner party. It was not easy work. By the time she had finished, the next doll perspiration was dripping down her face, and there was a brand-new blister at the base of her thumb. But she stepped back and surveyed her work with a glow of satisfaction. What next, she wondered. The water buckets needed filling. There was one in each stall set into a bracket to keep the horses from overturning it. She tugged at one but could not get it out. Like this, said Grant at her elbow, and handed her the bucket. Use the faucet at the corner of the barn. Rinse the bucket well before you refill it. The full buckets were heavy, but she made the trip 3 times, raising another blister and slopping a good deal of water into her loafers. Now what? She asked. Grant put down the bag of feed he was carrying. That's all, he said, grinning. Jane grinned back. Look, Jane, he said, I'm sorry I was so nasty, but I was in an awful temper this afternoon. I wanted to stay at school for the game, and I couldn't, so I took it out on you. I was in a sort of temper myself, admitted Jane, so let's call it even. Oh, look, the horses were crowding around the gate. They think it's dinner time. Explained Grant. If I don't let the gray one in, he'll come over the fence in a minute. I like the little bay best, said Jane. Do you ride him much? Sonny, I've handled him a lot. He's used to the feel of a saddle and a bridle. He could be broken now by a lightweight, but he won't be up to my weight for another year. Oh, breathed Jane. I weigh 97 pounds. He looked her over appraisingly. Say, that's an idea. Of course, I'd have to see you ride first. You need light hands for the job. Can you ride in those overalls? I can ride in anything, she cried. Okay, I'll saddle a lady for you, and I want you to watch while I do it, because next time you're going to do it while I watch. Next time, Jane's heart was singing as she vaulted into the saddle. Take her around the meadow a couple of times, Grant directed.